本日は AWS サミット東京2015デベロッパーカンファレンスへご来場いただき誠にありがとうございます。ご来場の皆様にご案内いたします。本日のオープニングキーノートでは講演の最後に質疑応答の時間を設けております。ご質問はツイッターで受け付けますので、スコットさんへの質問とお書きの上、ハッシュタグ#AWS サミット#DevCon にてツイートをお願いいたします。それではデベロッパーカンファレンスオープニングキーノートの開演です。Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome GitHub Inc. 共同創業者スコット・シャコン。
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to AWS Summit. I'm excited to talk today a little bit about something that I'm very interested in and passionate about. It's something that's interesting to me, working at GitHub, about open source and the enterprise. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how enterprises, how large companies are using open source, how enterprises and how open source have changed in the last 10 years. And where I see that trend going, and how that affects you. So I'd like to start out. By apologizing. Like a typical American, I came to Japan with no business cards. So if I see you guys at the booth later, I'll be at the GitHub booth at the exhibitor space. I have no business cards on me. And so if you present to me a business card, I will have nothing to give back to you. I sincerely apologize for that in advance. So this, if you can see it on the side here, this is my virtual business card to you. So please accept it. And if you need to get in touch with me, feel free to email me or contact me there. So I'm a co-founder of GitHub. I've been working at GitHub for about 7 years now. And one of the great things about GitHub is that we see both private repositories. There are millions of people using private repositories at GitHub. And there's also, obviously, tons and tons of open source. So we get to see how people are sort of combining these things. And I'd like to go back and look at what the world looked like before GitHub, what open source looked like 10 years ago, how developers have become more and more important over that time, and how enterprises have started to change in the same time frame to use more open source and to be involved in the open source world more. So I want to start out with developers. The world of software development and the importance of software in the world has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. This is a quote from Mark Andreessen, who wrote an article in 2011, I believe, entitled "Software is Eating the World," where he had two main points that we talk about a lot within GitHub. We talk about a lot in America, I think, of using this phrase, software is eating the world. And in the article, he talks about the difference in cost of starting a new company and starting an internet-based company or software-based company, and how dramatically the costs have changed from 2000 to when he wrote this in 2011. And the quote is, in 2000, the cost of a consumer running a basic internet application was approximately $150,000 a month. Running that same application today in Amazon's cloud costs about $1,500 a month. And today, so this was 2011, today, 2015, it's even less than that, right? You can run a M3 large instance on Amazon for, I think, about $100 a month now. So, you can have 15 of them for $1,500 a month. You can run a fairly significant sized web application for that. And so it's becoming very cheap, very inexpensive to run a company that is based on software with almost no startup costs. And at the same time, everybody is vastly more connected today than they were 10 years ago, right? Certainly than they were in 2000, but even than they were in 2011 when this was written. So today, everybody in this room, I assume, has an iPhone or has a smartphone on you. If I ask you all, you could probably pull out your phone and buy a book on your phone right now and have it at your house by the time you get home today, right? That is something that we're capable of doing now that was not possible 10 years ago, or was incredibly difficult, right? So he goes on to say, with lower startup costs and a vastly expanded market for online services, the result is a global economy that will, for the first time, be fully digitally wired. And uses examples like Amazon, and how Amazon has destroyed the book marketplace. You can't, in America, it's very difficult to go to a store and buy a book now than it was 10 years ago, because you use Amazon for that, right? Or if you want to watch a movie, right? I don't subscribe to cable anymore, so I use Netflix, or I use Amazon On Demand, or I don't subscribe to cable services anymore. And there's 100 other examples, right? I don't use a taxi anymore for the most part. I use Uber to get it everywhere. So these companies that understand software, that embrace software, that know how to use software, are destroying the ones that don't. Every company is a software company. So this is a quote from an article that we use this a lot in GitHub, because when we talk about what we want GitHub to become in 10 years, or what we want GitHub to become in the future, right, one of the things that's important to us that we think is true is that we don't really necessarily need to do a GitHub for music or a GitHub for some other thing. We really need to make GitHub for software developers good, because in the future, every company is going to be a software company. Regardless, so David Kirkpatrick was the first one to write. He wrote this in a Forbes article, I think, several years ago, where he said, regardless of industry, your company is now a software company, and pretending that it's not spells serious peril. So any company that does not have software developers working for them is at a disadvantage to a similar company that does, that is investing in software, that is trying to use software to make their company better. So some examples from GitHub, just companies that have open source on GitHub that would not be considered software companies generally. We have John Deere, has a lot of open source on GitHub, has software developers on staff, uses GitHub internally, and they make tractors, right, for farms, right? So if you think of any industry that probably wouldn't be thought of as a software company or a company that would employ software developers, a farming tractor company would probably fall within that, but that's changing, right? Or Walmart, which is a big box store where you go, to buy, pretty much anything, right? But you go there and you buy stuff physically, and they have software developers on staff, and they use software to improve their business all the time. Or Tesla, which is a car company which makes cars, right? This is a software company as well. So every company is a software company. And the farther that we get, the farther in the future that we go, the more and more things that become mechanized that can be replaced, right? At some point soon, I'm actually wondering if my daughter, I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I wonder if she'll ever learn how to drive, right? Because by the time she can drive in 10 years, will we really still need to learn how to drive, or will we have a self-driving car come up, on demand, and we get in it and it takes us where we need to go, and we don't have the safety concerns, right, of having all of these, of drunk people driving, or of having people that don't know how to drive very well drive crazy, right? We have robots do it for us, and they do it 100 times better, and it's far safer. So everything that you can think of, I think I like this quote, tell me something that you think robots can't do, and I'll tell you a time frame in which they can actually do it, right? So at some point, almost anything you can think of, there will be software involved in it. There will be software making it more efficient. There will be software making it better. So this group of people in this room, you guys are among, I think, going to be the most important people in 10 years, because you're the people that know how software works. You know how to get these things done. And the farther that we go and the more that is automated, the more important your jobs become in how things innovate, right? In how every industry operates. So developer tools. In the last 10 years, if you think back 10 years ago, if you were in the software industry 10 years ago, I assume many of you were. I actually had been out of college for only a couple of years at that point, but 10 years ago, we didn't have any of these things, right? Development on Git, so there was no Git 10 years ago. Ruby on Rails, if you use Ruby on Rails, there was no Ruby on Rails 10 years ago. We were running Mac OS Tiger, or actually we weren't running Tiger yet. So if you used a Mac, and actually far fewer of you probably did, you were running something before 10.3. EC2 wasn't around, right? If you wanted to run web servers, you had to actually physically buy web servers and put them in a colo or rent them from a colocation and use physical servers. You couldn't spin them up on demand like you can today for $100 a month. You didn't have an iPhone. You didn't have a smartphone. There was no Android, right? You literally had, think about the phone that you had 10 years ago. It was horrible. You couldn't buy stuff on the internet. You had no internet when you were outside of your house, right, or outside of your business. There was no GitHub, Windows Vista. So your tools as software developers look like this, right? And it's a vastly different world than we live in today. So, and it was only 10 years ago. It's not that long. So think about 10 years from now, right? How much different is the world going to be when this is what it's going to? I'll show you a screenshot of iPhone 6 and the latest Mac OS and a picture of Git, and that's going to look, ridiculous, right? It's going to look archaic to what happened, what we have, the tools that we have as developers in 10 years. So prepare yourself for that now. So developers are becoming more important. Software is becoming more important. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about how open source has changed in the last 10 years. Open source has changed dramatically in 10 years. If you were involved in open source 10 years ago, it was a drastically different space than what it is today. So to illustrate, if you were involved in open source 10 years ago, this will seem familiar to you. If you were not, I'd like to educate you, just talk a little bit about what open source meant 10 years ago. So I'm going to pick on an open source project called Redmine. I don't know if you use Redmine. I've heard some people, it's somewhat popular in Japan, actually, within some corporations to use Redmine. But I'd like to pick on it a little bit because they are an open source project, and they still take contributions today like most projects did 10 years ago, or actually the good projects did 10 years ago. So the last open source project that I contributed to personally before starting GitHub was Ruby on Rails. And before GitHub was around, this process I'm going to go through here was exactly how I contributed to Ruby on Rails. So first, you go to their website, which is horrible looking. And the beautiful thing about this is that it has advertisements on it as well. So you're going to this open source project, and you have an ad for a car rental company, which is very apropos, obviously. And you look for how to contribute to this project. And the how to contribute to the project is below the fold, right? This is a very long web page. So when you pull it up in your web browser, you don't actually see how to contribute. You have to hunt for it. You have to search for it. And then you do find it down in the bottom. And you say, great, I'd like to contribute to this project. And it's on all of the instructions on how to actually do it are on a different link. So you find the different link. You find that it actually took me a little bit of going through this website to figure out where it was. But I finally got there. So I'm simplifying it a little bit. But you get down to the bottom of the page again, below the fold, and it has instructions on how to help out. And there's a 6-point process on how to help out. And the frustrating thing is that if you wanted to contribute to open source at the time, every project that you wanted to contribute to had different instructions, right? Every open source project had some slightly different way of doing things. And so you had to read these, or else it wouldn't get accepted. So you read these, fine, you learn how to do it, you download the source code, you edit something, you make the software better in some way, and then you need to contribute your change. So it's Subversion. so you can't push back. You can't run subversion commit because you don't have access. So you need to create a patch of the changes that you made. So you run svn diff and make a little patch file, and then save that on your hard drive, and then go back to the website and open up an issue and attach that patch file manually, pull it off the hard drive, upload it to their server, write your whole description, and that's just for one change, right? And if it's a big change, that's a big patch file that's very difficult you can't do several changes and make it easy to peer review. It's a very difficult process. So then you try to get feedback, but there's no communication mechanism here, so you have to go on the mailing list and say, I did this thing, and link to it to try to get somebody's attention, or go into the chat room or something like that, try to get somebody's attention, bring attention to this so that they can review it, because there's hundreds of open issues, and some of them are dying, and it's hard to tell what is active. So then you get some feedback, and they say, well, that's not perfect. I'd like to change, you should change it in this way, and then I'll accept it. And so you're like, OK, great. And so you go through the whole process again. And after going through the whole process again, you get another patch file. And you go back to the page, and you re-upload it. And now your issue has 2 versions of the patch. And so now the maintainer needs to know which version is the most current one, right? Which one do I actually try to apply? Or they like it, but it's been a week or been a month, and other things have come in to the main line, and it doesn't apply cleanly anymore. And so they ask you to do it again, right? To create a new patch that applies cleanly to the main line, to the trunk. And so you do the same thing. And it's the same change, but so you can end up with a whole bunch of these patches, right? And it's very difficult to figure out what you're supposed to do, both as the maintainer and also as the contributor. And then they apply it, but when they apply it, it's applied as them, right? So the maintainer gets credit for the patch that you just submitted. There's no way to know by looking at the history of the project that you contributed anything to the project, right? Because you created a patch file that doesn't have your personal information in it. It was sent to the mailing list, or it was uploaded to this website. The maintainer downloaded it and applied it, and it looks like they did that work, right? So there's no real good way of even knowing that you contributed to the project. So that was what open source looked like 10 years ago. It was cumbersome. It was difficult. Every project had a slightly different way of doing it. Every project had a different website to go to find out if they even accept contributions and how. It was difficult to find the instructions sometimes, if they even had them on the website at all. Every patch was created manually. It was a difficult process. It was all uploaded manually. It was impossible to know if they'd apply cleanly. The maintainer had to download every patch one by one, try to apply it. If it didn't apply, go back and tell the original person this doesn't apply anymore, or do work to make it happen. There's no way for people to know that until it happens. History was lost when you apply patches, right? If you wrote it, you don't get credit for it unless they specifically write it in the commit message that this person did it, which is more work for them. And long-running series or large changes were very, very hard to do, right? Because if it was out of date, or if other stuff was going on at the same time, it would get out of date, and then it was a really huge pain to go and rectify, to fix, right? To make sure it applies cleanly. So the larger the change, the longer it takes, the more difficult it is to actually get it in. That's what open source was. Open source today is worlds different than it was just 10 years ago, right? Which is really not that much time ago. So open source today is honestly largely based around GitHub, right? Most open source projects are on GitHub now, or have mirrors on GitHub. And the process is standardized, right? So if you contribute to one project, you can contribute to the other 25 million projects on GitHub, right? Almost all of them use exactly the same standardized workflow. Most contributors to GitHub know how to do it. There are very few projects that go outside of that particular process, right? And so it's very easy to contribute. So you branch, you do all of your work in a branch, do a bunch of commits in that branch. You have your own namespace, so you can push it up and share it with people. It doesn't just live on your box until you create a patch and send it somewhere, right? You can put it up as a work in progress, and everybody can look at it while you're working on it. You send a pull request, which provides a domain for people to give feedback, a point for which people to give feedback, and then you can start discussing it, right? So you can say, this is what I like about this is what I don't like about this, on individual lines of code, which was very difficult to do before. And as people are giving feedback, you can fix them with new commits and push them up to the branch, and it automatically fixes it, right? You don't have to re-roll the patch series. You also don't have to keep it up to date with the main line, because you can pull from the main line. You can reintegrate the branch into your pull request branch all the time, right? Every day, every week. You can make it so that you're never more than a day out of sync from the main line. And it always applies cleanly. So none of these are problems anymore when you're using the pull request flow. And then when it's good, when the maintainer likes it, then they hit a button and it merges in. They don't even have to pull it down to their computer if they don't want to, right? Testing can happen on a CI server in Amazon or whatever. It's so much faster and so much easier, and it's the same everywhere. Every project on GitHub uses this. So in just 10 years, the difference in how to be involved in open source, the barrier of entry, the friction involved, has gone down very, very dramatically. So 10 years ago, every project had a slightly different process. Today, almost every project has exactly the same process. 10 years ago, every patch was created and uploaded manually, and it took a while. Today, everything's pushed to branches, and it's incredibly easy to do, right? It's almost easier to share the changes than it is to not at this point, if you're changing an open source project. Before, it was very difficult to know if changes would apply cleanly or would be difficult to accept. Today, there's a green button or a green box at the bottom of the thing that says this applies cleanly, right? GitHub checks it for you. So if it doesn't apply cleanly anymore, you can look at it and just see that and pull it down and fix it. But if it's green, then you don't have to go through that, right? You can verify it. History was always lost when applying patches before. Now everything is maintained. And 10 years ago, long-running series or large changes were very difficult to do. And today, you can integrate, reintegrate from the main line very easily, and it's very, very simple. So the biggest change, though, all of these things make the process easier. All of these things get more people into open source. But the most important thing, I think, is that the standardization of the process, right? This process is the same for all of the open source projects on GitHub, and there are millions and millions, tens of millions of open source projects on GitHub. So once you learn how to do open source, once you learn it on one project, which might take a little while, you now know how to do it for every other project, and you don't have to redo it. And maintainers and open source teams that maintain these projects don't have to reteach everybody all the time how to contribute. If you have a coder or somebody that wants to help, they already know how to do all of this stuff. You don't have to take your time to teach them anymore. In fact, on the Redmine project, as an example, which doesn't use the GitHub flow, right, this GitHub workflow, they have to specifically point it out that this is not what we do. So since this is how you want to contribute to open source, this is not how we take contributions, we need to warn you to not do what you're already trained to do. So it's the opposite, right? People already know how to do it, and you have to go out of your way to explain, do not do it this way, right? Stop the way that you're used to and do this different way instead, because this is how we operate. And this is the same for anybody that doesn't use GitHub. It's becoming an issue for projects that don't use GitHub. Like the Git project itself actually has a mirror on GitHub, but does not use GitHub for its primary development. The Linux kernel, likewise, Linus has a tree on GitHub, but they don't take pull requests. And so they constantly get them, right? People will go in and make a change to Linux, to the documentation or something, and they'll send a pull request because that's how they know how to contribute. And they have to, they get yelled at by Linus and said, don't do it this way. This is not how we do it. We have a process that we've run for 20 years. You need to, go back and research and, read for an hour before you can contribute documentation changes to us, which is off-putting, right? Which is unfortunate. There's more friction involved there. So, by the way, for the people that are using the simultaneous translation, does it sound like they're struggling? I'm just going to wait to see if I get a thumbs up or not. I don't know how far. I apologize. So as a result of making this process easier for everybody, One of the cool things about this is that on GitHub last month, so I just pulled these numbers yesterday, in the month of May, 1.8 million open source projects on GitHub, so projects that you can go and look at today, you could download, you can use. 1.8 million open source projects were pushed to in the last 30 days. So that's not how many are available. There are many more millions available to use, but these are the ones that are active, right? That actually had some contribution by somebody pushed code to them. So almost 2 million open source projects on GitHub last month, which is unheard of. It's insane, right? If you think about the state of open source 10 years ago, and you think about 2 million active projects on one website last month, it's a massive, massive change in open source and how easy it is to do and how ubiquitous it's become in our lives as developers. So that's how much open source has changed in 10 years. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about enterprises, about companies and their relationship with open source, because that has also changed massively in the last 10 years, I think in parallel with more people becoming involved in open source and open source being used in more places. Companies have had a very different relationship with open source in the past than they do today. So I use enterprises to mean companies generally, but the more interesting use cases, I think, are actually enterprises, very large companies. So one thing you see today that you didn't see 10 years ago is enterprises contributing to open source. So the Linux Foundation runs a report every year or 2 years, I think, I can't remember, where they go through all the kernel contributions for the year, and they try to determine where all the contributions came from. Who was writing code for the Linux kernel? And last year's report determined these are the top ranking companies of corporate sponsors of people that have added code to the Linux kernel. So number one is none, which is individuals, people in their spare time, maybe sort of how people think, how I think people consider most of the Linux kernel is written is by hackers in the basement, on the weekends, working on code, or students. But it is the most, right, of all of the groups, but it is still a very small minority. It's 14% of the Linux kernel is written that way. The majority of the Linux kernel, 80% of the contributions to the Linux kernel this year, were done by corporations, right? Were done by companies that pay people to work on Linux. And so when people think about open source and free software, and they think about the Linux kernel and the GPL license, they think about open source hackers. But in reality, the really good, large open source projects are mostly being written by corporations, by companies who make money using Linux or supporting Linux or doing something or need it for some reason. And they invest in it and they give those investments back to the community. So a good example, I think, of that is, or just an example, since we're at AWS, is Amazon, right? So not a ton of contributions, but there are a number of patches where Amazon has paid developers to get patches back into the Linux kernel, presumably working on Zen, right, on the Zen infrastructure. And they use them, and it makes AWS better. And but also as a side effect, everybody trying to run Zen on their own servers get these contributions as well, right? It impacts the entire community. It helps Amazon. It helps people not using Amazon. And everybody gets the benefit from it. GitHub does the same thing, so not to the Linux kernel, obviously, but we contribute heavily to Git, right? Even though we didn't write it in the first place, we don't own it. We obviously depend on it, and since we're such a large Git host, we see all of the use cases, all of the edge cases, all of the strange things that happen in Git when you have lots and lots of people using it all the time, race conditions and whatnot. And And so we fix those, and we supply it back to the Git infrastructure, or the Git project. And now everybody that uses Git, whether you're using GitHub or not, actually, in fact, the people that probably benefit from that the most are our competitors, right? People also running Git on their servers that don't have to find all of these race conditions and don't have to fix all of these problems because we've done it for them, right? But that's fine. That's what happens, right? That's what open source is about, is differentiating on something other than this and giving back to the community. But more and more, you're seeing companies do this. So just sort of randomly looking at GitHub, at companies that have an open source presence on GitHub. Here's some companies that I pulled off of their pages. But you're seeing companies that you would not have imagined. In fact, if you'd had a meeting with Oracle or IBM or SAP 10 years ago and asked them what they thought, or Microsoft, and asked them what they thought about open source, or if they would like to do open source, right? Imagine having a meeting with somebody at Microsoft and saying, so, we'd really like you to start open sourcing .NET, right? How do you think that meeting would go? Probably quite well. No. It would probably not go very well at all, but today, .NET is open sourced and is on GitHub, and more than half of the contributions to .NET now, today, come from outside of Microsoft employees. They're amazing open source contributors. If you go, in fact, to microsoft.github.io, you can see hundreds and hundreds of open source projects that they've open sourced. They're fantastic at it. They're very good community members. They're very good maintainers. And it's incredible. And it's a huge change from 10 years ago. The other thing you see with enterprises is enterprises building on open source. So, for example, EC2, right? If you're running EC2, you're running a lot of open source code, right? And you're paying Amazon to take away things that are painful about it. So you're running Linux, you're running Zen, hypervisor. But you're paying Amazon to provide the infrastructure as a service. And it makes things easier on you, but you don't have to, right? You can download Zen and Linux, and you can run your own stuff if you want to, but is it really worth the cost of that, right? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but it's built on open source instead of Amazon writing their own Linux distribution that's not available to you, right? Or Docker, right? If you want to use Docker for deployment, you can use the container services that Amazon provides now, instead of having to run your own infrastructure for that. Or Git is a great example. You can easily run your own Git server if you want to, but you can also use open source for GitHub, or we can pay us to provide that for private stuff for the same thing, an infrastructure as a service, right? So this is starting to become a thing where more and more companies are building on open source rather than building their own proprietary things and trying to make it easier for you to use it, right? So that if you want to, you can use it for free, but if you don't, you can pay somebody to make it easier for you. Microsoft actually is a great example of this as well, where if you download Visual Studio now, and it has Git integrated into it, right? Instead of writing their own distributed version control system, they took one that was already being used by the open source community and the private community as well, and they built that into their proprietary service so that to try to make it easier, right? To try to be standards compliant rather than trying to invent from scratch and have it be totally proprietary. So enterprises are starting to look at open source instead of proprietary as a solution. Enterprise using open source, so using it internally. If you work at an enterprise, 10 years ago, if you had said, I want to build this enterprise class application, and I want to, it's going to make us millions of dollars, and you went to your boss and said, but I'd like to use MySQL and not Oracle database, right? You probably would not have a job. It would not go over well because you're not choosing, nobody ever got fired for buying Oracle, I think is a phrase in America, but that's changing, right? Today, if MySQL is now run by Oracle, right? Is now provides support by Oracle, so you can go to Oracle and choose open source or choose proprietary, but it's a valid option to choose an open source database for a very important piece of your infrastructure, and that was not true 10 years ago. If you're looking for a serious version control system for your enterprise, right? More and more and more companies are using Git now as their version control system for huge companies, for telecoms, right? For huge businesses. And 10 years ago, they would never have looked at Subversion, right? Or at some open source version control system. They would have looked at Perforce, or they would have looked at Team Foundation Server or Rational. And they would have paid a lot of money for an expensive proprietary system. And today, that is almost entirely not true. Most companies, most enterprises are going to get if they're changing version control at this point. And finally, enterprises learning from open source. So this is something that's very interesting to me, and something that we've seen more and more as GitHub has gotten larger, and as more people are using GitHub in a professional manner, but also GitHub clones or other types of version control systems that are similar to us. So SAP uses GitHub internally and wrote a case study about it, and it's very interesting to me because what they did is they use our Inside the Firewall GitHub Enterprise thing, and they have their own private GitHub within their company. And the cool thing about it is that, you don't have to use GitHub. You can, there are open source clones and stuff, but I think ours is good. But what's interesting about it is that you have a little open source community within a large organization. And so all the things that you benefit from in open source, in the open source community, you can benefit from in your company, right? So you have more visibility into what other teams are doing. There was a paper written about this by the University of Victoria that I thought was very interesting. And they sort of summarized the paper by saying, research has shown interest in the potential of replicating open source software style practices within commercial organizations building proprietary software. So we're starting to see more companies look at the open source world, look at what works well within the open source community, and trying to move that into their company, right? And trying to replicate the successes of open source within a private organization. So having visibility into what other teams are doing, sharing code between organizations within a company, contributing to each other's code bases, even though the different aspects of the company may be working on different things. Seeing development styles, right? JPL made this graph on their own. They use GitHub internally as well. They have a lot of engineers, and they have all of these different groups. And they found that now they're seeing more groups within JPL work on other projects that they didn't own before, or seeing coding styles that were good or better or worse than what their team was doing in some other team, and trying to either fix them to make the other team work better, which is good for JPL as a whole, or learn from them if they're doing something better, right? So the whole organization is sharing openly and learning from each other collaboratively. Right? So the whole organization, given the more openness, this open collaboration model, improves as a whole, right? Because there's more. In the past, 10 years ago, again, if you're using a code depot and all of the code just goes in there and there's no visibility and there's no way to comment on it and there's no way of seeing what other companies or what other teams in your company are doing, there's no way to learn very easily from each other. And today, there's now a social aspect to there can be a social aspect to all of the developers within an organization. So another thing from the paper stating that transparency and a common workflow that I was talking about before that you see in open source can promote open collaboration and allow organizations to increase code reuse and promote knowledge sharing across their teams. So this is one of the great things of a company, of an organization, an enterprise, looking to open source and saying what works well here and how can I use that within my organization. So there are other things that they've taken as well that we're starting to see. So not all companies do these, but we're starting to see companies do it, and I think it's very interesting. So workflows. 10 years ago, if you did open source development and you worked at a company, which was most open source developers, you had two very different styles of working, right? When you go home and you work on open source, or if you worked on open source for your job, you would have one very distinct workflow and set of tools and way of working, and then at your job, you would have a totally separate, very distinct way of working. So in open source, you would tend to be using Subversion, this open source centralized version control tool. You would be creating and emailing patches to each other. You would have totally distributed teams that you were working with, so people from all over the world. You would probably never meet anybody that you worked with on your open source project in real life. All communication happens in chat. All communication happens in email and via code. They were self-organized, so nobody would tell you what to do, right? You don't join an Apache project and say, tell me what to do, and they assign you tasks, right? You come in and you see what's available or what's interesting or what doesn't work for you, and you fix that and you contribute that, right? So people choose what they work on. And you never meet anybody in person. So if I work on Apache for 5 years, there's a better than even chance that I will never meet another person that works on Apache, even if I talk with them every day. But Apache Web Server is very good. Zen is very good. Linux is very good, right? But these people never meet each other. In the corporation, in your company, when you work on software, that may be very similar, right? That may be doing very similar types of things than the open source equivalents. It's a totally different workflow. It's a totally different way of producing software. So you have expensive proprietary version control systems, again, 10 years ago, right? You'd have Perforce or something that you'd be working with. You never see open source projects using Perforce. You'd have ACL access control mechanisms that were very complicated, where I can only see or access or commit to certain things within my company, but I can't see everything. I don't know what everybody's doing. I can't learn from everybody else in the company. Everybody's in the same room, right? This is still very true today for companies. All of your software developers that are working on the same thing need to be in the same room, right? You have task managed, so you're not choosing necessarily what you're working on. You're assigned what you're working on. And you have daily meetings. So every single day, you have to meet with everybody on the team that you're working with and talk about what you're going to work on that day. And so again, you could be writing an operating system, an embedded operating system for a phone or something in your work, and you could be working on Linux in your spare time, and you're doing almost the exact same type of thing, but in two very, very, very different ways. That 10 years ago. And it could be true today, actually, for many of you. But we're seeing more and more companies learn from open source and adopt some of the strengths of open source within their corporate environments. So you see widespread use of Git in corporations, right? Which means that if you're working on open source or you're working on your corporate project, you're using the same version control tools on both projects, right? You don't have the expensive proprietary one in one and the free kind of crappy one in the other. You have a really good solid one for both, and you don't have to know two different ways of working. Branch development. So you're working in branches. You may be using GitHub or something similar internally. You may be able to work on something without disrupting the rest of your team and trying it out. So you have this branch-based development, both open source and corporate, right? You could be working in distributed teams. We're seeing more of this than we were 10 years ago. GitHub, for example, we have hundreds of developers, and very few of them are in the same place. I don't think any of our software development teams have everybody in the same office or in the same state, even, in most cases. We're highly distributed around the world. So you're seeing more companies do that, taking advantage of new tools with software development and looking at how open source works and saying, what can I learn from this, and how can we create good software the same way that this huge group of people that have never met each other create good software. Team organized, so maybe not individually self-assigned, maybe not given individual tasks, but something in between, right? Where here is what the company finds important, and then you choose what you're good at or what you want to be responsible for. So having more self-assignment. And open processes. And online coordination, I think most importantly, so that you can have these distributed teams. So less email, less meetings, more chat, more GitHub, more online, things with URLs that you can reference later, whether you started at the company last week or 2 years ago. So we're seeing more synchronous collaboration. This is a map of FreeBSD contributors, which, again, they're all over the world. Open source project. This is a map of where everybody in GitHub currently is, which is there are about 300 people in GitHub, and we have employees in almost every state in the United States. in many Western European countries, in Australia and Japan, we have people all over the place, and they're all working together using these online tools, right? Very few of them have daily meetings, so it is possible, and we're seeing more companies do this type of thing as well. So those are the three things that have changed massively in the last decade. Developers and software is becoming more and more important and will only continue to be. Open source development has become simplified, and massively more people are using it and are being involved in it and are being open source developers and open source maintainers than ever before, and we're only seeing that go up. And enterprises are becoming more deeply involved in open source, both in producing it and consuming it and improving it than ever before. So the future, just as sort of an interesting thought, I think, this is something that I saw a couple weeks ago. In the United States, the White House, the president's office, put a document management and oversight of federal IT resources online on GitHub. The Markdown source is on GitHub. And it's deployed to a website, so you can go and you can read management and oversight of federal IT resources. And it's generally meant for sort of public consumption and have people provide feedback on it. But a US congressman, so a representative, a state representative, changed it, right? Suggested a change to this document and said this is how it should read, and provided a very complicated description of why. Like why it should be this way, a great explanation of why the wording should be changed in this way, and submitted it as a pull request on GitHub. And then the White House's, the president's lawyers look at this, and if they think that this is a good idea, and the president agrees with it or the president's office agrees with it, then they can hit the merge button, and then it goes live, and then that is what government employees look at to figure out what is management and oversight of federal IT resources from that point forward. So this is a very different way of doing position papers or doing policy in the United States. And I think it's really, really interesting. And I think we're starting to see more of this, of more things, seeing this great collaboration model that works very well for software developers and using it for things that aren't code, but are code-like, right, that are similar. Laws are very similar to code. So the future of enterprise development. I think in the future we'll see more of a continuous spectrum from open source to closed source. Well, I think we'll get to the point where there's very little difference between working on open source projects and working on proprietary projects that are in your company. The only main difference will be if the bit is flipped so that people outside your company can see it or not, right? But that the processes and the workflows will be very, very similar. I think more companies will be doing more with less, using more open source, using more Zen instead of writing their own operating system, being more involved in open source and being able to go farther faster with less money. I think we'll see more companies figuring out how to be software companies or being overtaken by companies that are software companies. So in 10 years, many more companies, if you're in a company that doesn't have a software development team, then you're in a company that is probably not going to be around for that much longer. And I think we'll see more inclusion of, like I was showing with the state representative, of people that aren't coders involved in this process. Copywriters looking at code or contributing to documentation, artists, authors, product, right? Legal team. This is actually a thing that we use at GitHub, where if we have a product that's going to go out, we can CC our legal team. Our legal team is in our GitHub instance. And we can say, legal, can you check this out? And the legal team will come in and read it or look at what the feature is and say, is there, if we wanted to do like a license picker or something like that on creating a new repository, we could say, legal team, can you look at this and see if this is fine? And they can look at it and they can provide feedback in the pull request, or even change something, change some wording on the site or something if it's easy enough, right? So involving more teams in the code that runs your company, right? I think will be even more ubiquitous than it is today. So that's it. The key takeaway, I think, from all of this is learn from open source, right? If you're not an open source developer, look into it, contribute to something, understand how the process works, because it's only going to become a larger part in your organization and in your competitors' organizations. The open source community works differently and works in an interesting way that you can harness and you can take advantage of and you can learn from to make the way that you work in your companies better, right? More efficient, more powerful, more interesting, cheaper. And that's it. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Scott, for the presentation.
Thank you.
皆さん、こんにちは。Amazon の安田と申します。これからの時間はですね、皆様
So I would like to take time to entertain the questions and go into the QA session.
question is about the role of the software developers and software company. So you mentioned that every company is becoming a software company. And could you talk a little bit about how the company, which is yet to become a software company, can become the software company in the future? And what's the role of the software developers to transform the companies to a software company?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's fairly easy to look at your company and decide whether it is a software company or could be more of a software company, just in how difficult is it to do the things that you need to do, right? I mean, if you're a car company, I mean, there's a lot of things that are difficult. I mean, at the long end is, can software drive the car for you, right? Just rethink, what are we trying to do as an organization? If you're a car company, what are we trying to do as a car company? We're trying to get people from point A to point B as safely as possible, as efficiently as possible, right? What ways can software make that better? Can it drive the car for us? Can it, figure out how to fill up or get more energy while we're sleeping so that we don't have to waste our time getting gas? Can it find more efficient routes for us? Can it what? Right? What can it do? What can software do that people used to do or that our customers used to have to do, right? What can we take off their plates? And I think you can do that in almost any industry, right? If you come and see me after this, it's probably a really fun exercise to do, right? The thing that I actually really like doing is be easily frustrated by things, right? As a consumer. Like if you're using something, if you're using your company's product, be as easily frustrated as possible, right? And say, it's so annoying when I'm in the airplane and I have my headphones in and the speaker announcement comes on and it hurts my ears, right? Can I use software to fix that somehow? Like there's always some way of something that annoys you that you can use software to fix, or you can, or you should be able to at some point in the future. So, and software developers, I think, are the best people to answer these questions because they know what's possible with software today.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
So the next question is talking about open source project. In the last decade, you mentioned that the open source project has been evolving very rapidly. So the question is, what would you see in the next decade about what is open source project would be? So do you see any future of the open source project in the next 10 years? And how would you like to contribute to the change?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I think open source, it's hard to know where open source will be, but I think you can do the same type of thing. What frustrates you about open source development today, right? What are the things that are difficult? Documentation is very difficult today. It's hard to get good documentation. Most open source software is quite ugly, right? So, and those things are because writers are not involved in the open source process. Designers are not generally involved in the open source process. Pure open source software tends to not have these people involved in it very much. So I think opening the doors, making it easier for them to contribute, making it easier for people like that to get recognition from doing these so that they can make it, get a job in a software company because they can point at, here's documentation I wrote for this project, or here's design I did for this project, or UX, user experience stuff. I think involving those types of people into open source in a way that is easy for them and seamless for them improves open source projects, and it helps those people as well, right? So I think that's going to be a big part of open source, is including more types of people in the process.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on to the next question. The next question is more like an enterprise and a workflow you mentioned. Especially, we'd like to hear more about how the GitHub itself is running process. So we know that you have the remote employees all over the world, and how would you communicate among the employees, and how you are trying to minimize the cost of the communications.
Sure. Yeah, so it's not true for every team within GitHub. I think certain teams, finance, leadership, are more or less co-located. But all of the development teams, all of the software development teams, all of the design people, all of the support people are all fully distributed. So people live wherever they want to live in the world, generally. And for that, basically, we make it so that the office is not used for communication, right? So chat rooms are incredibly important in GitHub. We have a lot of stuff in chat. That is our real office and has been pretty much from the first day of GitHub. Everything important that should be said is said in a chat room so that you have a URL that you can reference later. It's unambiguous. It's easy to tell what happened and what people talked about and what was decided if it's all transcribed, right? And chat rooms provide that for you that in-person communication does not. And GitHub, we use GitHub for all sorts of stuff. Our HR team uses GitHub, our human resources team. Our legal team uses GitHub, right? And it's all internally open, so I can go and I can see what HR is doing by their issues or by drafts of HR policies that they have in Markdown in a repository. I can send pull requests to it, and we can have a discussion about those changes before being merged, right? Or legal stuff for NDAs, right? If we wanted to have a new NDA or a new IP intellectual property assignment thing, it'll go in the legal repo, and I can look at it as an employee and send a pull request and say, I don't want to sign this section, can we remove it? And I can have a conversation with our lawyers about that, and it can be merged by the legal team, right? So, so that can happen just as easily from Paris than it can from San Francisco. There's no advantage to living in the office for those types of conversations. So, you know, that's what we try to do as much as possible for those teams is have everything have a URL, have everything be asynchronous as much as possible, and have everything be non-interruptive. So I can't interrupt people to get their attention right that moment, right, if they don't want to. And that's very, very important for people that want to be able to work remotely and be as effective as people in the office.
Okay, so it's very interesting to hear that even the legal process are using the Git to pull requests to handle the NDA and other contract issues.
Yeah.
And it comes to the next questions. And you had mentioned in the future that even the White House trying to use the GitHub and to come up with a policy-making process. So this is very interesting. And could you talk a little bit more about what other application can be applied with GitHub and what they could do?
Sure. I mean, I think legal is the easiest and most immediate thing that, because their problem sets are so similar, the way that legal teams operate, so if you negotiate a contract today, if you have office space and you need to negotiate the lease, or you need to sign an IP assignment or whatever, if you have a negotiation involved where you're trying to figure out what the final document is going to look like, GitHub is fantastic for that because the way that legal teams operate today is very similar to the way that open source teams operated 10 years ago, right, before Git and GitHub was around. So you'd email somebody a version of a Word document, and then they would look at it and change it, and then send you a red line, and then you'd look at the changes, and then send them another red line, and you can't send it to two people because they can't change it at the same time. Like, you have to kind of lock it so that somebody else can do it. But really, it's all words, right? I mean, it's not... Laws aren't that dissimilar from code. It is interpreted in a very specific way. It's all, words. People read it and can comprehend it. So I think, legal teams, people work with words, people writing blog posts, people writing legal documents, any writers. I wrote a book, Pro Git, and it was all done in Markdown, and we were able to use pull requests to collaborate on it. And it's just such a better process to do it in plain text where you can merge things and you can see differences and you can do stuff in branches simultaneously and asynchronously. So that's where I think that's why the White House started using it, to help work on policy so many people could edit it at the same time without having all of this problem of contention of multiple people looking and editing at a document at the same time. So the same things that we learned in how to have multiple software developers work well together on one document, on one piece of code, I think applies very well to people working on text or people working on legal matters or things like that. So that's why I think the White House found it an interesting experiment. You also don't need to give people commit bits at the beginning, right? Or basically at any time. You don't have to give people as much trust. You can see what their change is going to be and then decide if you're going to accept it, which is not the case with wikis, which is not the case with sort of emailing documents back and forth, right? Like it's much more difficult to do that. So I think you'll see more and more places, if you can find a mergeable format for something that you want people to work on together, to see more of a GitHub type flow, even if it's GitHub or not, to see a GitHub type flow happening.
Okay. So we'd like to change a little bit and then talk a little bit more about the next question about security. So some audience says like there is a security, may have a security concern to use like open source product or open source community, or so then enterprise, given the enterprise will learn open source, then how the community or enterprise should handle the security concern, especially in the GitHub workflow or other open collaboration.
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on your security vector that you're concerned with. So, you know, what are you concerned with? If it's privacy, companies, you know, use our GitHub Enterprise to run it internally instead of using private accounts on GitHub.com. If they don't, you know, they don't want to put it in the cloud, or can run it in their Amazon instance, right? You can run stuff on EC2 to control that security apparatus. If it's that you don't trust other teams within your organization, you can put ACLs in. They're you know, for GitHub specifically, I can't talk to all of our competitors that provide a similar type of service, but you can say, create teams and say, you can see this and you can't see this, and you can write to this, but you know, you can read it but can't write to it, and you can administrate it, et cetera. So there are basic ACLs as well that you can do that if you're worried about access within your company. But yeah, it depends on what exactly you're worried about. There are, you know, security concerns from open source, using open source in general. So there was a Firebug. What was the? There was a SSL exploit. You know, there's sort of open source exploits that happen from time to time. But you know, exploits happen in proprietary software as well. There's 0 days on all sorts of proprietary software that you use. I would prefer to use something that I can patch an hour after it's discovered and deploy to my systems, which we were able to do for the SSL exploits that came across in the last year, rather than wait for a proprietary vendor to issue a release to us. So it's just much easier for us to be able to control that process. So, and if it's open source, you have thousands and thousands of people looking at it for those problems constantly. So it's much, I think, more difficult to have bug, every bug is shallow with thousands of eyes, right?
Okay, thank you. So this is the next one is the last question for you.
Sure.
So since we have a lot of software engineers here in Japan, so could you talk any advice or feedbacks or comments to the audience here in Japan?
Sure, yeah. I think the most important thing for the future is to be involved in open source in some way. So I think the best thing that you could do to learn new practices, new ways of developing software in a new and interesting way is to get involved in open source software yourself. So find a project, do a small contribution, use it in your company if you can, or try to open source something within your company to be a maintainer. Figure out what it's like to work with a community on an open source software project. And if you have any questions, you can ask us. We help companies do this all the time. And there's great companies that do it that you can look to for advice, like Microsoft, actually, that was not involved for a long time and is now very, very good at it, right? So see what they're doing and how they're doing it. But get involved in the open source community because it's going to be a part of your company, or I'm sure you're running Linux somewhere, or Android, right? There's open source involved in your stacks already, most likely. So learn how to be a citizen in the open source community, because you can learn a lot and it's quite important.
Right. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
ありがとうございました。
スコット・シャコン様、安田さん、ありがとうございました。